Hello, everyone. My name is Mel Hartley, and I'm one of the team members here at the Training Accreditation Council. And I would like to welcome you to this webinar on the revised standards for RTOs, which is our first webinar on the newly released revised standards. This webinar will provide a high-level overview of the key changes introduced in the standards. And while we won't be able to delve into the specifics of each individual standard during this session, we will discuss the overall framework and highlight the most significant differences from the previous version. Before we go any further, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and community. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Torres Strait Islander peoples. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Claire Werner, who will be facilitating this session for us today. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Mel. Hi, everyone. It's great to have you all here with us this morning to talk about the first of our webinars relating to our new standards. So today you will have access to all of those documents in the chat. Mel has put a link in the chat for you. And you've also got, this PowerPoint. But as Mel said, there's plenty of things coming and we'll get to those. So in our session today, we have got a number of things that we're going to talk about. We've got 90 minutes to talk about these things. So we're going to have a look at the reasons why our standards have changed. We'll have a look at the structure of the revised standards, what's similar and what's really significantly different in these revised standards, what kind of guidance is available to you as an RTO, and how the regulators are dealing with these new standards. And it's very early in that journey, an implementation timeframe for that, for those new standards, and what you could do now to actually be ready for that 2025 implementation date, which is 1 July 2025. Now, as Mel mentioned earlier, we're going to use Mentimeter for your questions, and you can see the Mentimeter code on the screen in front of you right now. You can use that code to pop in your questions. We've set aside some time at the end of the webinar to have an open forum discussion, and at that time, we'll also be joined by Kane Depiaz from TAC. And so Kane and I will try and answer all of your questions. There might be things that come up that we don't have an answer for yet. If that's the case, then we will take those questions under advisement and come back to you. So let's get started. Why are these standards changing? This is a really important question to ask because vocational education and training provides a really strong economic and social outcomes for Australians, and all of our governments, state and federal, have been working in partnership to actually improve the VET system. So the reform agenda has actually been in place across 2 successive federal governments, and in that time, all aspects of the VET sector have been reviewed and focus areas for reform have been identified. So our current government has got a range of focus areas that they're looking at, and I'm pretty sure you would have heard of many of them. So things like the National Skills Agreement, qualification reform activities, supporting micro-credentials, governance of the sector, so the establishment of the Jobs and Skills Councils, and the very recently released national skills plans. They're all part of this reform agenda, and the reason that we're here today, quality reform. So in regard to quality reform, there's some very specific objectives that the government is seeking to achieve, and they are the objectives that are on the screen in front of you now. So they want to strengthen the focus on quality outcomes for learners and employers, provide greater clarity for RTOs and regulators, to allow more flexibility and innovation in training delivery. And you'll notice we're starting to talk about training. to better reflect the diversity of the vet sector and to ensure that all the standards are really fit for purpose across different RTO settings, because our sector is actually a very, very diverse sector. So we've had quite a long journey to get to where we are today. Back in December of 2020, right through to September of 2021, there were 2 phases of consultation that really focused on understanding what the quality issues were in our sector and the effectiveness of the current standards and exploring solutions to some of those key challenges. The key concerns that were brought up with the current standards were a lack of clarity, a focus on areas that don't necessarily lead to quality outcomes for learners, the prescriptiveness that could actually limit RTO's ability to deliver flexibly and to innovate to suit their operational context. And, that feedback indicated that practices tended to be driven by administrative processes and also this fear of non-compliance. So there were lots of challenges that fed into the work that was then focused on drafting those revised standards. And that happened between October of 2021 and October of 2022. So those drafts were actually developed and refined in collaborations with all the state and territories, with all of the vet regulators. They were informed by sector feedback. We looked at other regulatory frameworks in other sectors to see what they did. There were expert reviews of those drafts, and there was a whole lot of research that wrapped up to give us those changes that we had. So when it came to the structure and the content of the standards, what was proposed was a much clearer and more direct link between the requirements of RTOs in terms of what they're expected to meet and the outcomes that they're actually supposed to deliver for learners. So in November 2022, we had an early draft of those standards released for public consultation, and that was accompanied by a consultation paper which explained all of the background. And RTOs had the opportunity to provide written feedback on those drafts, but also to participate in a whole range of online and face-to-face forums that were held around the country. So we had all of that feedback, and then in October 2023, the draft standards were actually piloted across the country, and all of the outcomes from those activities informed the final version. So some of you might have been involved in the TAC pilot. Our pilot really focused on the aspects that were different from the 2015 standards, and we really saw it as an opportunity for RTOs to have a look at their existing evidence and to test its suitability to demonstrate compliance with the revised standards. To identify if the standards were actually easy to interpret or were there any areas of ambiguity. Where there might be areas where there were difficulty in meeting those requirements, and to really pinpoint any areas where additional guidance might be needed, because of course that would inform any development activities that we undertook. So some key issues that were identified here were that some RTOs might find it really challenging to move from a system of inputs and prescription through to one that's really based on outcomes with less specificity, and that it was really important to provide guidance and examples to assist RTOs in meeting those requirements. So in March of this year, we had the early changes to the standards come into effect. And here we are today in October, still October, where we actually have the policy version of the standards released to us. So, quite a long journey where there has been, substantial trialling and feedback and opportunity for consultation. And as Mel mentioned earlier, it's really important to note that this is the first of many development opportunities that TAC is going to be offering to you. So we're starting with an overview of the changes, as you saw in that outline, and then there's a whole lot of webinars and fact sheets that are going to be released over the coming months that are going to support you in those areas of significant change. So when we talk about our regulatory framework, it's really important to remember that the regulatory framework is actually one part of the vet quality framework, and the vet quality framework really details all of the requirements, with our standards just being one of those. So RTOs actually have to meet all of the key requirements that sit in the vet quality framework. So we have the revised standards for RTOs, which include the outcome standards, the compliance requirements, and the credential policy. So they sit as a package. We have the fit and proper persons requirements that you have to meet, and the changes there have been in place since March. They were part of the early changes. We have the Australian Qualifications Framework, which of course guides the nature of the qualification outcomes that we certify. We have a financial viability assessment that has to be met. We have the data provision requirements, and we have the Vet Act and Vet General Regulations here in WA. So when we talk about the revised standards, it includes 3 documents. So the webinar materials that you've been sent, so you've been able to access these in the chat box, actually include copies of all of these 3 documents. So the first is the outcome standards, and these are the standards for RTOs, and they're just that, the regulatory standards against which all RTOs are going to be measured in the audit process. So they are outcomes-based standards that are then measured using performance indicators within the standards. We're going to spend a bit of time having a look at the structure of each of those documents. The compliance requirements are the more administrative requirements that RTOs are required to meet. For example, do you have the required insurance? Are you using the NRT logo correctly? All of those types of administrative requirements are now grouped into that one document called the compliance requirements. And we also have the credential policy. So what this policy does is it actually details the requirements of vet trainers and assessors. Now, in our past regulation, these requirements were actually included in the standards in Schedule 1. So any changes that we wanted to make to those requirements were really quite time consuming because we had to change a piece of legislation. So the credential policy, again, groups all of the requirements for trainers and assessors into one document that's far more easily updated when we need to do that. The information that's in that policy is actually going to be really familiar to you because it reflects the trainers and assessors requirements that were included in the early changes to the standards, which was March of this year. So DURA have just finished taking feedback from the public on those compliance requirements and the credential policy. And based on that feedback, there may be some changes to these policies in future versions. They were released as draft versions. There's also a policy guidance document that's been provided by DURA, which we're going to discuss in a little bit more detail later in the session. And that's been put there to support the revised standards. It's really aimed at helping you as an RTO to actually work with outcomes standards. So maybe we should start with those. Let's have a look at the outcome standards. So these look quite different to the standards for RTOs of 2015. The revised standards have 3 levels. They have an outcome statement, they have the standard, and then they have performance indicators. So in our revised standards, there are actually 4 quality areas that are expressed as outcomes, and we're going to have a look at those in a minute. There are 24 standards within those 4 quality areas, and they have been grouped into the quality areas. And these standards introduce performance indicators. So under each standard, there are performance indicators to provide greater clarity around the systems and processes that RTOs should have in place and be able to demonstrate to ensure compliance with those standards. The reason for this is it really responds to strong stakeholder feedback to provide greater direction to RTOs and regulators without imposing undue prescription by stipulating the exact actions that RTOs needed to take. So let's have a closer look at one of those. So we start with the quality area, training and assessment. So what you see here is one standard, in this case, standard 1.1, which is about training. So this standard greatly expands on our focus on the delivery of training in the sector. That's something that's been asked for a long time. And the reason for that is the delivery of training is an area where we've had really quite substantial negative feedback. While we have, many wonderful RTOs out there that do a great job, there are also RTOs in our sector that don't provide quality training. And what has happened is this has begun to undermine industry's confidence in training outcomes. This is a response to that feedback, and what you can see there for standard 1.1 is the 5 performance indicators that are included for that standard. So a standard is that training is engaging and well structured and enables students to attain skills and knowledge consistent with the training product. And then we have these 5 performance indicators that help us understand what we're supposed to do to achieve that. So we have to make sure that the training is consistent with the training product. We already understand that language because we have in our current standards that assessment is consistent with the training product, so that's been extended. The mode or modes of delivery enable students to attain the skills and knowledge consistent with the training product, that the training is structured and paced to support vet students to progress, providing sufficient time for instruction, practice, feedback, and assessment. So this is a really lovely addition. Often when, we talk to people about how training happens, we have instruction and we have assessment, and we don't have any kind of focus on allowing students to practice, get feedback, and improve their skills. Training techniques, activities, and resources engage vet students and support their understanding. And where the training product requires work-integrated learning, work placements, or other community-based learning, the necessary skills and knowledge are able to be attained in that environment. So when you have a look at the standards, what you're going to find is that every standard is structured in the same way as this. There will always be a standard, and then there are a range of performance indicators that sit underneath that standard. So when you actually spend time having a look through all of these standards, and we don't expect you to have memorized it yet, but when you spend that time, what you're going to see is that there's quite a lot in there that will be familiar to you, that you will look at and you'll say, well, I already do that. And there's also going to be some new things in there. The second part of the suite of documents that we're working with now are the compliance requirements. So the compliance requirements describe those things that every RTO has got to meet. And again, they're grouped into 4 areas, the 4 areas that you see here. So we have information and transparency. This area is focused on how you manage and store information that you hold as well as how you provide information to potential students. The second area is the integrity of nationally recognised training products, and this area is focused on certification and certification management, and it includes the transition of training products. The third area is accountability. So this area is focused on all of the legal requirements that have to be in place in an RTO to actually underpin governance. So it includes things like insurance, fee protection, how you manage third-party arrangements. And there are also schedules. There are 2 schedules that are included, and these are fit and proper persons requirements and the use of the nationally recognised training logo. So once again, nice clear structure, and you need to have a look at the detail, and all of these are structured again in the same way. So here's an example for you. This one comes from the information and transparency area. So we've got an area heading. In each of those areas, you've got these focus areas. So this one is about information management. So it clearly states the things that the RTO has to achieve. They are the 2 compliance requirements that are sitting here. So in this case, for information management, we've got to make sure that vet students' personal information is securely maintained in accordance with applicable privacy laws. So this allows us to look at laws at a national level and at a state level when you use this type of language. And the RTO has got to securely retain completed student assessment items for at least 2 years following the vet student's completion of a training product. So really clear statements about what you need to do. Here's another example for you. This one, the focus area is certification. And again, you're going to see some similar things here. The RTO is only going to issue certification documentation to a student that it has assessed as meeting the requirements of the training product, and has to ensure that that documentation is issued within 30 calendar days of the assessment. And then there's some other things that you have to focus on there. So they're really black and white requirements for everyone to actually follow. So the third of these documents is the credential policy, and this outlines the credentials for trainers and assessors undertaking particular training and assessment activities or roles. So it is divided into the 3 sections that you see on the screen. Section 1 is the credentials for the delivery of training and assessment generically across the sector. Section 2 is focused on the credentials for delivery of training assessment specifically from the TAE training package. And Section 3 is focused on the validation of assessment. When you're looking at this policy, it's really important that you read it in conjunction with the outcome standards and the compliance requirements, because those documents are referenced throughout this policy, and some standards have additional credentialing requirements. So let's have a little look. So this is out of Section 2 of the credential policy. So this is the requirements for delivering the TAE training package. So each section of the credential policy has got an explanation. In this example, you can see that it's for trainers and assessors, and it links you here to the standards. So that's what I was mentioning earlier, in that you have to read these documents together. Then it goes on to list the specific credential requirements. So in this case, it's for delivery of the certificate for in training and assessment, or the assessor skill set. So when you have a look at that, you will see all of these requirements sitting here. They're very specific and very clear. And this information is actually going to be really familiar to you because it is almost identical to the early changes that you've had in place since March. So TAC has a webinar on those early changes and on the training and assessment requirements, and there's a fact sheet available on this as well. Mel might pop it in the chat box for us. So let's take a closer look at these outcome standards. So as I mentioned earlier, the standards contain a lot of information that you are going to be very familiar with. In the next part of this session, what we're going to do is have a look at what is similar in these standards and what is really quite different in these standards. So let's start with having a look at these quality areas. When probably all of us look at these 4 quality areas, we'd say, well, we already focus on these areas. And the outcome statements will probably be very, very familiar to you as well. So when we talk about training and assessment, the outcome statement is that quality training and assessment engages learners and enables them to attain nationally recognised industry relevant competencies. Student support, we want to make sure that vet students are treated fairly and they're properly informed, supported and protected. When we're talking about the vet workforce, we want to make sure that vet students are trained and assessed by people who are qualified, skilled and committed to professional development, and that the vet workforce is actually supported through workforce planning. So again, this is an existing concept, but it's not that well understood in many RTOs. So fundamentally, we're making sure that we have the right people to train and assess, and the support of our learners is by good planning rather than by good luck. Governance, we are looking at effective governance is in place so that it supports quality vet delivery by ensuring the integrity of operations and a commitment to continual improvement. And again, that continual improvement or concept of continuous improvement is something that we have been talking about for some time. And again, TAC has a webinar that was provided earlier in the year about continuous improvement and how you can support your business through continuous improvement. So many of these standards actually contain concepts that we are very familiar with, and for many of us, we already implement in RTOs. The list on the screen is just a few examples of those things that might be familiar. But when you look at them, they are likely to read quite differently because they have been written as outcome standards. So the concepts might be expressed quite differently in these standards. And so, you know, validation, if we just look at that first one, validation is one of those examples. So since the introduction of the previous standards in 2015, we've actually been conducting validation based on risk over a 5-year cycle. And when you had a look at those clauses that were about validation, it was that you had a plan in place, that the right people did it, that you validated the correct number or proportion of your scope over a 5-year period. So validation has been there and it is there now, but we're looking at it a little differently. So the standard statement, and this is actually on page 5 of the standards that you've been provided in that link, talks about the assessment system is quality assured by appropriately skilled and credentialed people through a regular process of validating assessment practices and judgments. So validation as a concept is there. this time it focuses on the outcome, that you actually quality assure your assessment system. It then has a number of performance indicators underneath it, and they are that validation of assessment practices and judgments ensures the assessment system consistently produces valid assessment judgments that are consistent with the requirements of the training product and the requirements of these standards. The second performance indicator, validation for each training product on the RTO scope of registration, occurs regularly and at least every 5 years, as informed by risks to training outcomes, any changes to the training product, feedback from vet students, trainers, assessors, and industry. So I'm hoping that already you can see the very significant change to the way this concept, this familiar concept, is talked about. Third performance indicator, a risk-based approach is used to determine the components of a training product to be validated and the sample size of assessments. So this is one that gives you a lot of opportunity to think about how your RTO operates, your size, your scale, your throughput of students, and to choose and put a sample in place that's going to work for you. Validation is undertaken by one or more people who collectively have industry competencies, skills, and knowledge relevant to that training product, a practical understanding of current industry practices relevant to the training product, and one of the credentials for validation specified in the credential policy. So again, you can start to see the connections between these documents. We have got our standards referring to the credential policy. In addition, where an AQF qualification or skill set is from the training and education training package that enables individuals to make assessment judgments is being validated. So when you're validating from the TAE training package, the persons undertaking validation are independent and not employed or subcontracted by the RTO to provide training and assessment, and validation occurs following completion of training and assessment by the first vet student cohort. So as soon as you have done it, you've got to check that it's working if it's related to the TAE. Validation outcomes are not solely determined by those who have designed or delivered the training and assessment. So this was a change that was put in place with the early changes to the standards, and how validation outcomes are used to inform revisions to training and assessment. So while there's a lot more information there for you, it's focused on the outcomes that you're supposed to achieve from the validation activity. And there's a lot more information in there for you in terms of how or what you might need to consider as you're doing this. So I guess the message is, even though these concepts are familiar to us, you need to look at it in the context. You need to look at each of these in the context of how they're actually expressed in the standards now. Credit transfer is another example. We all understand credit transfer exists now. And we have got some information in here about credit transfer. So 1.7, vet students who have previously completed an equivalent training product are supported to have their training recognised. So we have to make sure that the RTO demonstrates that vet students are offered opportunities to seek credit transfer and are made aware of the RTO's policies for this. That credit transfer is based on evidence of prior completion of an equivalent training product demonstrated by AQF certification. So that might be a statement of attainment or a qualification, or an authenticated vet transcript, unless that's prevented by licensing or regulatory requirements. And that's very rare. Decisions about credit transfer are fair, consistent, and transparent, and they're documented. So again, familiar concept, it is expressed in quite a different way. So you do need to have a close read of what is sitting in the standards and understand what that outcome looks like in your organisation. We also have some quite significant differences in the standards. So there are a number of areas in these standards that are going to be new to many RTOs. The most significant differences are what is shown here in this diagram on the screen. So we might start over here with continuous improvement. So as an explicit concept that sits in the standards, it's new. And we have a number of standards that focus on it. 2.7, 2.8, and 4.4 focus on continuous improvement. And we have done one webinar on this, and we're doing another webinar on this in December of 2024. And Mel's just popped the details of that webinar in the chat box for you. Child safe organisations. So depending on the sector you work in, this might be something that is familiar to you, and it might not be. So standard 4.3 has performance indicators that focus specifically on the child safe principles. And in fact, next week on Monday, we have a webinar that is about creating a child safe organisation. So if you're able to join that webinar, that will be very helpful for you. Inclusive vet environments. So again, this is something that we have touched on a bit in the past, but it is very specific in standard 2.5, and we will be having a webinar addressing that requirement in early 2025. So you need to watch TAC's education program to see when that's coming out. Information prior to enrolment, again, some very specific requirements there in standards 2.1 and 2.7. The webinar for that will be mid-2025. Wellbeing. This is standard 2.6. Again, we'll have a webinar in early 2025 around wellbeing. The fit and proper persons requirements, we have had changes since March. This is standard 4.1. We do have a webinar recording and a fact sheet available to help you with the fit and proper persons requirements. Mel's just popped them in the chat box for you. And cultural and safety awareness, this is standard 2.5. And again, there's going to be webinars in December. So those webinars in December, they are going to help you with cultural awareness training and this inclusive environment. So please watch out for those and join us if you are able to. So we're going to look at a couple of these areas in a little bit more detail now. We're going to have a look at child safe organisations and wellbeing. So the concept of a child safe organisation is something that you might not have encountered before. Our standards now include performance indicators that are focused on child safety. So where an RTO offers training or assessment to vet students that are aged under 18, risks to their safety and wellbeing are identified and managed consistent with the principles for child safe organisations, having regard to the training content and the modes of delivery. So fundamentally, this is saying every organisation has got a responsibility to keep children and young people safe. Child safe organisations are actually organisations that create cultures where the safety and well-being of children and young people are prioritised, and actions are taken to identify risks and to protect them from harm. So we have nationally a number of principles for child safe organisations, and the idea is that these provide a nationally consistent approach to embedding child-safe cultures and practices at all levels in organisations of all sizes and across all sectors that actually engage with children and young people. And there are 10 national principles for child-safe organisations. The first of those principles is that child safety and well-being is embedded in organisational leadership, governance, and culture. And this is a really, really big one. Mel has added some information into the chat box for you on this, because often we forget to focus on culture. Children and young people are informed about their rights, they participate in decisions affecting them, and they're taken seriously. The third principle is that families and communities are informed and involved in promoting child safety and well-being. Principle 4 is that equity is upheld and diverse needs respected in policy and practice. Principle 5 is that people working with children and young people are suitable and supported to reflect child safety and well-being values in practice. Principle 6 is that the processes to respond to complaints and concerns are child-focused, and they often aren't. Principle 7 is that staff and volunteers are actually equipped with the knowledge, skills, and awareness to keep children and young people safe through ongoing education and training. So this, for example, might be something that you're thinking about in the professional development that you offer to your staff. Principle 8 is that physical and online environments promote safety and well-being while minimising the opportunity for children and young people to be harmed. And there is a tremendous amount of information available around the damages and harms that can be caused when we're in online environments, and what we can do to help children protect children in those environments. Principle 9 is that the implementation of the child safe principles are regularly reviewed and improved. And principle 10 is that policies and procedures document how the organisation is safe for children and young people. So they are a very wide-ranging set of principles that really touch every part of what you might do as an RTO if you have children and young people as your student cohort or involved in the training that you offer. So there are some resources that are available to help you. The Department of Communities has a page that is focused on child safety for organisations, and it links you to a whole range of information and resources. That's what you're seeing on the screen in front of you. This part is your pathway to get to this organisation. And all RTOs actually also need to be aware of the Ombudsman of WA's mandatory reportable conduct scheme. So the reportable conduct scheme provides independent oversight of how organisations that exercise care, supervision, or authority over children handle allegations of and convictions for child abuse by their staff. So Mel has just put some more information in the chat box for you about that one. Information on both of those are available from the Department of Communities and the Ombudsman's webpage. And TAC will also be going through all of this information on the webinar next week on the 28th of October. And as we look at all of this information next week, it's focused on supporting RTOs in particular. So that would be a great webinar for you to attend. So well-being is another area of the standards which is different. And, you know, the reality is well-being, that term well-being, means many different things to different people. So generally, when we think about well-being, what we understand it is that when, you know, a person is comfortable, healthy, or happy, you know, it's a term that is often used to describe the overall quality of a person's life. So well-being is not just about the absence of illness or stress, but it involves, a really positive state where individuals feel satisfied with their lives and they function effectively in, their personal lives and in the social domain as well. So when we talk about well-being and think about the key aspects of well-being, generally we think about physical well-being. That's often the first thing that pops into our minds. So, this really involves good health, good functioning of the body, nutrition, exercise, absence of disease are all things that we would think about there. Emotional well-being, this really relates to how you manage your feelings, coping with stress, how you maintain a positive outlook. Mental well-being, this involves your cognitive health, your ability to think clearly, to make decisions, to engage in learning, to engage in lifelong learning. Social well-being, this is about supportive relationships, having that sense of belonging that we know is critical to well-being. Your ability to actively participate in the community, to participate in social activities. Economic well-being really refers to financial stability, so you having access to resources and the ability to meet your basic needs. This is something that has been in the media a lot recently with the cost of living crisis. And environmental well-being. And this is really about being in a safe and healthy environment that supports quality of life. And so when we're talking about safe environments, we're not only talking about physically safe environments, we're talking about psychosocially safe environments as well. So when you think about this concept of well-being, when it's such a broad concept, how would RTOs actually approach the requirements of the standards, which is what you're seeing on the screen? And the first aspect of that is really that we identify the cohort's needs. And there are many ways that you could do this, depending upon the size of your organisation and the student cohort that you are dealing with. So we have a few suggestions for you to think about. This might include things like having wellbeing surveys as part of the information that you collect. So you could ask about people's physical health, mental health, stress levels, overall satisfaction with the program. Those could be conducted at particular times in your journey so that you know what happens before the program and after the program. So you can see change and impact in terms of how you are providing training. If you're in a small RTO, you might, for example, have one-on-one interviews. You might meet with them to talk about their expectations for the course, any concerns that they might have. And you might schedule periodic meetings to actually monitor progress and address any emerging needs. You might be in a situation where you can run focus groups. So you might have sessions where participants can actually share their experiences and bring up common challenges that then allows you to address those as an RTO. So for example, if stress management is coming up or, that work life, we might say work study balance is coming up, then, that might be something that you can put some kind of support in place for. Of course, you can watch the students. So, all of the trainers that you have in the learning environment with the students will recognise signs of stress and disengagement or burnout during the sessions. How many times have you actually, in fact, just on Monday, I was talking to a trainer who said, I let my class go to lunch early because I could see them all just flagging. So, you have a very powerful tool in the trainers that are in the classrooms with the learners. Notice changes in their engagement. Notice things like reduced participation or increases in absenteeism, and think about how you can address those things. You could have suggestion boxes to provide a way for students to give you anonymous feedback. You might use digital platforms to do the same kind of thing, where students could express their concerns confidentially. You might have peer support systems. This is one that we know is really effective. Mentorship programs or buddy systems where you've got that peer-to-peer check-in that happens. You might look at diversity and inclusion surveys, understanding cultural backgrounds and specific needs for participants from those backgrounds. And you might find that in some organisations you have the capacity to actually collaborate with some experts in this area. So, for example, you might have mental health professionals involved, so maybe psychologists or counsellors involved. And you might also consider external audits. So have third-party organisations actually evaluate the wellbeing environment in your organisation and think about what you could then do. So that was a huge list of things that you might be able to do. The important thing is understanding that what you do is supposed to be tailored to your students and your environment. So think about what's possible and think then about what's right for your student cohort. So how could you actually promote wellbeing in your RTOs? So one of the things we talk about is healthy lifestyle choices. Regular exercise, balanced nutrition, adequate sleep, they're all things that we would have heard. So if we just pick one of those things, for example, balanced nutrition, it might be that you have on your RTO's campus a cafe of some kind. You might, for example, look at the menu that exists in that cafe and maybe it can be tweaked to actually provide some healthy choices. It might be that you provide students with information about cafes around your campus that actually provide them with healthy choices. Things like mindfulness and stress management, like time management is one of the things that comes up in here. And again and again and again in RTOs, we get feedback from students about the stress that exists around doing assessments when they often cluster together at the end of a term or a semester or a period of training. So even just working with everyone who delivers and assesses in a qualification and thinking about how you space out the assessments in that qualification and how you provide information to learners about what's coming up. So, a tool that I use myself is I have a 30-day look ahead. So when I think about what's coming up in my work, I go, oh, I know that's a really important time frame and I have to work back from that. You can do the same things with your students and help them understand and build that skill that will not only help reduce stress for them in the learning environment, but then they could take into the workplaces with them. Building relationships, investing, time in friendships and family and community involvement, and, putting things in place within the training environment that is about building a learning community, building the cohort, the relationships in the cohort might be something that you might like to consider. And of course, continually learning, engaging in activities that actually stimulate your mind. So think about how you structure your learning. We've got a lot of information out there now around instructional design, putting things in place for, the different types of learners that you might have in your classroom. So when you think about well-being, there's so much information out there. You come back to the standard. You think about how you know what your learners need and the strategies that you put in place for them and how you know those things are working. No one organisation is probably going to take the same approach, and we wouldn't expect the same approach to be in place across every organisation. So it's really important that you do think about this for you, because there are so many benefits that we know, that when you put wellbeing front and centre, we know that participants are more engaged and they perform better when their wellbeing is supported. We know that you have higher retention rates when wellbeing is used to actually reduce dropouts. And we know that organisational reputations are improved when they demonstrate a commitment to wellbeing. So, and that's not only about attracting students, it's also about attracting staff. So some of these concepts that are sitting in the standards are very different, but they also have the potential to provide enormous benefits to your staff and your students. So the TAC education program is available to all RTOs. If you go to our website, then you'll be able to see the upcoming webinars and the support resources that are available to assist in the transition to those new standards. So some of those things that as I've mentioned, we already have done some webinars on, and some are still coming. So I wanted to talk to you about, and like I'm just noticing a number of questions popping up in the chat box. If you pop those questions into Mentimeter, then we might be able to come back and address those things in our question session at the end. Okay, so what do you do now? We would suggest that you take a phased approach to thinking about these new standards, and this is just a rough timeline that you might like to consider for your RTOs. So first up, you need to take some time to actually become really familiar with the revised standards. So we would suggest that you spend some time dissecting them, making sure that you have a consistent understanding within your RTO of what these standards are saying. If you take the time to do that, what it will allow is for you to then critically reflect on the way your RTO operates and think about any changes that might need to be made within your RTO. We would suggest that you would need to have done that by the end of this year. So there's a few months really for you to pull them apart, digest them, and think about what's happening in your RTO. In early 2025, we would like you to be focusing on making any changes and implementing any new or revised systems that you think are needed in your RTO. What this does is it allows you to actually have some time to put those systems in place and then to make sure that those systems are working as you intend them to do. So around March, April is a really great time for you to think about some kind of review, internal review, formal review, where you have a look at what you've done and you make sure that it's working, and where it isn't, because nothing's ever perfect, where it isn't, you can make those refinements to the changes that you have made. We all know that things do not always work the way we intend. So whatever time frame you use, you need to have enough time in there to allow for that review and refinement process. So to get to the point where we have this planned implementation where everyone's supposed to be in place and working against these standards from the 1st of July next year, the council is actually going to have to make some changes to the vocational education and training general regulations. The planned implementation for the Training Accreditation Council and RTOs regulated by TAC is July 2025, that is subject to those changes to that legislation being made. As you're aware, we have state elections coming up. So sometimes those things can affect the timing. So the TAC update would be used to keep you up to date if there was any change to the timeframes that we've talked about today. Whatever timeframe or timeline you choose for your RTO, and it is up to you, please make sure that you have given yourself reasonable time in regard to your size and scope. So some of you are going to choose a much shorter time frame than this. No one, of course, is going to choose a longer time frame. So as you are preparing and moving along this journey, remember that there are going to be those PD opportunities that TAC will provide. Attend when you can. When you can't attend, then you'll be able to access the recordings and the materials from those webinars. So RTOs are not the only stakeholders that need to fully understand the new standards, and the regulators are also going to be working to adjust their systems and processes. So over the next few months, what you're going to see is information coming out to you around any changes that might be deemed necessary at this point where we are 3 weeks into having these standards. It's very, very early days. So I guess the message is keep your ear to the ground. And to help you do that, we have an online guidance hub that we have put together at TAC. Mel has done this with the support of TAC. So what we have done is we have got this online guidance hub, which is really designed to provide you with a reliable source of truth for WA RTOs. This online guidance hub is going to replace the user's guide that we have had with previous versions of the standards. And what you will find is that this is aligned to DUA's policy guidance document, and it's really aimed at providing you with clear, accessible understanding of the standards intent. So the hub is going to be regularly updated with fact sheets, webinars, podcasts, and any additional guidance that's produced to ensure that you have got the most current information. So this page needs to go into your favorites. So the hub, you access it via the TAC website, and it's been divided into 10 sections. So the first section is over here. This is the overview. And what that does is it provides information on the role and the focus of the standards and its application across Australia. We talk about the vet quality framework and the structure of the outcome standards. Then we have each of the 4 quality areas from the outcomes standards. So again, information that is related to each of those areas. We have the compliance requirements documents, the credential policy, and the vet regulations. So this is the one that I was mentioning earlier that is going to need to change for us to be able to implement these standards here in Western Australia. There's also a glossary section. So each of the documents that we've talked about, the outcome standards, the compliance requirements, and the credential policy has a glossary. So those glossaries have been consolidated into one glossary that will sit in this section. And we're also having a frequently asked questions section. So TAC is going to be updating this frequently asked questions section as those consistent issues become apparent So I've mentioned a couple of times that we have this policy guidance document from DUA. This has been incorporated into the online guidance hub from TAC, and it will be built on by TAC through specific fact sheets and webinars and podcasts. Each of the quality areas, and you can see the 4 of them there, the online guidance hub structures this information in a consistent way. So for every one of those, you are going to have an overview of that quality area. You're going to have description that sits around the intent of the quality area. You will have information that sits around the intent of each standard within the quality area. And then you are going to have additional resources and guidance, and TAC is going to be adding those things over the coming months as they're developed. And then you've got a section about related standards, and that is about linking the standards together. So in the same way that you used to have in the user's guide, where we've gone through and we've looked at how all of these standards actually work together, we've done the same thing here. So it's about understanding, I guess, themes throughout all of these documents in that area. So we really want you to be informed about the new resources and the new initiatives as they become available. And for that, we would really encourage you to subscribe to the TAC update if you're not already subscribed to that. And following the Humanics page for webinar announcements, and connecting on LinkedIn for all of the latest updates that we have about these standards. So let's just look at the resources that are there now, and this is really summarising what we have talked about over the last few slides. So we have our online guidance hub, which we have just talked about, and the link is there in the standards, and I think Mel put it in the chat box as well. We are in the process of revising fact sheets, so all of our existing fact sheets are being updated to align with the standards, and we're creating new ones to actually address any information gaps that might exist. We've got a whole range of webinars and podcasts that are coming. They are based on the feedback from the TAC pilot and surveys of RTOs. And those webinars are really going to focus on areas where you as RTOs have expressed a need for further clarification and guidance. So the ones that are coming up soon in terms of culturally safe learning environments for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, inclusive learning environments, continuous improvement, child-safe organisations. They're big ones that we know about. So again, I would encourage you to provide feedback on areas that you think are not clear and where you would think we might need some more support. And of course, DUA also have a number of resources that are available on their website. So this is the federal government department. So they have the policy guidance document and overview. So you can access them from DUA's website, or you can access them from ours. They have been included in the online guidance hub. So there's a lot of resources out there now, and there's many more to come. So we get to the point where we can ask some questions. So please pop them into Mentimeter if you haven't already. We will do our best to answer them. There might be questions in there that we can't answer yet. If that's the case, then we, as I said earlier, we'll take them on advisement and we'll come back to you about that.
If I can just quickly cut in, Claire, I've noticed that there are a lot of questions about specific answers to some of the standards, and we won't get into those today, but what we're going to do is take a note of all of those, and they will help inform our guidance documents. So in this webinar, we're just going to focus on the more generic questions. So thank you, everybody.
Okay. So this is one of the questions that we have got a webinar coming up. I think it was early 2025 specifically on this. So in this case, I would refer you to that webinar as it comes up. Yes. So when it comes to the TAE10 and getting to July, we have very specific units listed in our regulation now. No one will be getting that qualification. Everyone who has a TAE10, and I'm one of them, with those 2 units, those units will meet the requirements because they're specifically named in our regulation. Once we get through to the new regulation, those extra units are not included. That's one of the things that's different from the early changes to the standards. So the requirement sits there now and it will change next year. The hub's available now, right, Mel?
That's exactly right. So go
Yes.
on to that link that is in the chat and or from the TAC website, and you should be able to access all of the materials now. Another question was, does it replace the TAC users guide? And yes, it does. This will be our new users guide.
Yes.
Pretty much all of the rest of the questions are around specific standards, and I know that everybody really wants to know the answers. But we are going to be updating all the fact sheets and doing webinars as Claire has said. So I just ask that you keep an eye out for all of those.
I just want to summarise the things that we have talked about today. So the revised standards are in place to assure the quality of the outcomes in the vet sector, and they are one of a whole raft of skills reform activities. The revised standards are actually made up of 3 documents. We have the outcome standards, the compliance requirements, and the credential policy. And those 3 documents are one part of the broader vet quality framework, and all RTOs meet the vet quality framework. There are lots of really familiar concepts in those revised standards, but they are very different structurally. So as an RTO, you're really going to need to spend some time reviewing those standards, getting to understand them, getting to understand the structure, so that you can fully understand how your organisation will actually meet its obligations in terms of quality and compliance. Those standards are available now, and support for RTOs is going to be growing. So use the online guidance hub to keep up to date with all of those changes, and that is where the new fact sheets and everything will be linked there. Am I correct in that one, Mel?
That's right. So the fact sheets will still go on the normal fact sheets page, but we'll also be linking them in the guidance hub in the relevant sections. But we'll keep everyone updated on what we're doing in our TAC updates and on LinkedIn.
And then just a final reminder that as an RTO, we are all required to comply with the vet quality framework, and these revised standards as a part of that vet quality framework will be required to comply with those from the 1st of July 2025. That is the current plan, and we'll keep you updated if there are any changes to that timeframe. So we're very happy to take any feedback that you might have about this webinar. You can also send your questions through to TAC, and TAC's email address is there. We are very, very interested in, what is challenging for you and what you would like more information on. We would recommend that you follow TAC on LinkedIn, on YouTube, sign up for TAC Talks or the TAC Update newsletter. And we would encourage you to complete this survey, and you have the QR code sitting there on the screen. So we are continuously improving our education program. And one way we can do that is through your feedback. So please take the time to complete the survey. Thank you so much for your participation today. I know it's a really different webinar when you sit there and do nothing and I do all the talking. It's usually the other way around. But, today was really about providing you with that first lot of information. As a few of you have mentioned, we've all got some light reading to do now. So off you go. Read the standards, get familiar with it, and we will look forward to talking to you again very soon. Thanks for attending.